Hello, students. This week we're going to be looking at Chapter 13, Crisis Intervention. As in your career as a human service professional, you are going to be dealing with crisis at some point, individuals in crisis. And so this chapter is going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. How do we define crisis, and how do we respond to it? And so how do we understand crisis states? And so your text goes into the work of Eric Linderman and talks about the classic definition of a crisis state and what that looks like. It talks about how this response is an adjustment to whatever is happening. And when we're going through a crisis, we may maintain that level of adjustment throughout it, and then even after the crisis is done, because that's kind of sort of the state that we're maybe stuck in a little bit. And then crisis decompensation will result because of the stress, the ongoing stress that we deal with after that situation happens, again, either during or after. And so what we see as a successful adjustment is that we regain our normal coping mechanisms, not necessarily go back to the way things were before, because the event may have changed us or impacted us in some way. But as far as baseline levels of dealing with stress, we return to that pre-crisis level. And so that's kind of the flow of how a crisis state would go in the healthiest sense. And so successful pre-crisis resolution is sort of the requirement, or what we consider to be the direction that we want to reach, right? The place we want to get to. A lot of this really depends on the client's perceptions of the event. And so as you may be aware of or have heard of before, or even experienced for yourself, that there may be multiple people who experience an event and they all walk away with very different impacts of that event. And it's, related to our perception of what happened. The text then gets into what makes an event stressful, and it talks about, the unknown, kind of either things taking us by surprise, but also what is really important is the perception that our lives, or others that maybe we care about, were threatened in some way. So it could be threatened as far as our lives, right? So like it could be potentially deadly, or it could be a threat to our way of life or things like that. And so there's a little bit of a variety in that. And so if we have a higher ability to deal with a variety of events happening in our lives, then we're more likely to deal with crises and move through that kind of crisis cycle and regain our pre-crisis state. Whereas if we have a lower ability to deal with different types of events, then we're likely to maybe get stuck in that crisis cycle somewhere. And then it talks about crisis response to disasters and how that, what that looks like. Some common signs that you will often see, again, your textbook kind of highlights more of these, but these are sort of the most common three that you might see, are that the individual starts to seem really preoccupied and not able to focus as opposed to pre-crisis. So this may be the individual in general, but noticing a change in their preoccupation after the event. The person may experience some level of guilt over their inability to resolve the problem or even prevent it. And so they feel like maybe they could have or should have done something different. And in some cases, maybe they had a choice. In other cases, maybe they really didn't. And then another one that they highlight is that the individual feels hostile towards the world and others. And so maybe there's some anger there that they're taking out on people that they blame, or just kind of taking it out on people because they don't necessarily have someone to blame and it's just coming up out of them. The textbook also identifies this list of problems. They identify 12 problems from Parrott and Resnick research that they did. And so you want to take a look at that, as well as some other kinds of problems that may occur in an individual after a crisis situation that can give you an idea that maybe they're struggling or need some additional support. All right, so this is behavior during or crisis behavior during major disasters. And so some common after effects could be psychosomatic. So even if they weren't physically injured, they start having physical symptoms that are related to the event, but maybe they don't quite realize are related to the event. There can also be a sense of loss. And again, this could be, the loss of like an individual or, a person they care about, but it could be also a loss of the way of life they had before or abilities that they had before and things like that. There's also social stresses because maybe there could be some separation between them and their typical social supports, or just changes in those relationships related to the crisis, or even, the recognition that my social supports don't totally understand what happened. They don't understand what I've been through, and so there ends up being that divide. There could also be results of physical trauma. And so, if the trauma was harmful to the physical body, they could be dealing with the impacts of that, healing and rehabilitation and things like that. And then also psychological. So there could be a lot of depression present, low motivation, a lot of anxiety, hypervigilance. The list of psychological impacts sort of is pretty extensive. Also, disorientation, hysteria, and psychosis are more significant ones that have been identified. There were also phases of post-disaster that have been identified, which is heroic, honeymoon, disillusionment, and reconstruction, which again, you can kind of read about in your textbook. It's the way that people might cope after disasters happen and the behaviors that you might see in them. And it's not to say that any of these are completely unhealthy or healthy. Sometimes they look a little bit different in different people. And sometimes people really take them to an unhealthy place. And sometimes they really just help the person to adjust and kind of move on after some kind of disaster has taken place. So some common crisis situations that you may face, of course, this list is not exhaustive and there can be many, many, many more, but family and marital problems, and that can be within, your immediate family or extended. The death of a loved one, and that can be a family member, a friend, someone, that you've known well, or sometimes it could be someone that you don't even know that well, but they kind of, have some kind of meaning in your life or they've represented something for you. Criminal victimization, and so that is a broad spectrum of things that could happen. It could have been a criminal victimization, or it could have even been a potential victimization that was thwarted, but then that fear exists. Or even the victimization of someone close to you and that fear that it could also happen to you. Changes in employment, which again is a pretty broad spectrum of things, and then even retirement, which relates to that. Retirement, a lot of people think of as something really positive and exciting, but for some people it can be really difficult. So how do we intervene in these crises? So interventions made within a minimum of delay. And so the sooner someone can intervene and help the person, and the shorter time period that those crisis reactions occur for, the more likely the person will have a successful outcome. Interventions are also time limited. And so sometimes, a person can have intervention for a really short period of time and it can make a really big difference. And so they don't necessarily have to have long-term counseling. The client social network is used, which is really important. So as human service workers, we should be making sure that they're connecting to their natural support and network within their life. The client is seen by more than one worker. So maybe they're seen by like a crisis worker and then a counselor, or also maybe a physical doctor and things like that. And so if they have multiple either workers or agencies involved, that can definitely be have increased potential for success. The intervention is focused on their current life situation. So again, with crisis, it's not about going into the person's past, it's about dealing with the situation at hand. And if that person does have crisis from the past that have not been resolved or coming up again, then they would likely need more ongoing counseling. But the goal of crisis counseling is to focus on what is sort of the current stressor or most recent event. Trust and rapport must be established. So we talked about that before with being a human service worker, but specifically with crisis workers, you have to have that ability to establish that rapport very quickly and to engage with the client in that trusting way very quickly. Also, the client self-esteem and reliance is reliance supported. And so there are obviously certain characteristics about the client that we can kind of tap into to help them as well. So crisis intervention for the crisis worker. So if you happen to be a crisis worker, or maybe some of you may have had this experience of working in crisis situations in the past, you'll know that this can have a pretty big impact. There are sort of secondary traumas and things like that that can occur. And especially if we're not taking care of ourselves and engaging in self-care and having our boundaries, this puts us more at risk for having a response like this. And so some areas of symptomology are changes in the thinking patterns, psychological, we talked about those already, somatic, so having those physical symptoms, and also changes in our behavior. And so those are things to look out for in ourselves, but also our coworkers, supervisees, supervisors who are working in these areas. So the goal and setting of crisis intervention is that intervention activity, it can be at the field site of a disaster, transportation vehicles, emergency rooms, walk-in clinics, hotlines such as suicide prevention hotlines or other support hotlines, and also mobile services. And so in your area, you would have to kind of identify some of the things that could be around. And I know that that is the goal of one of our discussion posts for the semester, is identifying what supports are around, maybe not specifically crisis, but what supports are around us. And so in summary, looking at this chapter, the client's postponed help until crisis proportions can be really unfortunate. People will often not reach out when issues initially occur. They wait until things become really unmanageable, and it does make things harder for us to treat and to help them. Crisis intervention is important to intervene as soon as possible, recognizing the common signs and symptoms so that we can address them, making note of crisis intervention programs that might be around or maybe that you're even working in, and then recognizing the long-term problems that you might have to refer the client out for additional services for. And so that is it for this chapter. Make sure you read the little cases in there and the questions, the thinking questions that at the beginning of the chapter, and take a look at the end of the chapter for all of the resources that are given to you to help you to really incorporate and understand the material. So that is it for this week, and you will see me again when I talk about chapter 14. Thank you.